Okay, good to go.
All right. Let me just get myself settled here. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Julie Edmunds from the Serve Center at UNCG, and I'm delighted to actually present findings not from North Carolina, from a study that I've done with my colleagues Eric Griebing and Victoria Coyle here at the Serve Center. And actually, for those of you who attended Dr. Stout's presentation, she could not have given a better introduction to what we're going to talk about today, because you'll hear a lot of the same themes come up. And in addition, and I did not realize this, but the student that she quoted regularly, Janae, is actually now at Columbus State, and Columbus State is the organization that was implementing this project. So there's actually a tremendous amount of overlap between what Dr. Stout just said and what we'll be sharing here today. So as Dr. Stout made these points so eloquently today, I think we're all here because we believe that dual enrollment has the potential to really improve student outcomes, and it has been shown to improve outcomes in post-secondary education. But in general, it really has been implemented in ways that often reinforce existing inequities. And this was exactly the point that Dr. Stout was making earlier. So you see, for example, that certain populations of students, such as Black and Hispanic students, first-generation college goers, and low-income students are really underrepresented in dual enrollment programs. And then we see that white students, in a recent analysis done by John Fink, are participating in dual enrollment coursework at essentially twice the rate of Black and Hispanic students. And so we're going to examine the impacts of a program today that has had some luck at expanding access for historically underserved students. And I would ask, as you're going along, if you have any questions about the program or about the results that you're seeing, or want to make any comments, feel free to add information in the chat. There will be points where I'll stop throughout the presentation and we can take a look at what's going on with the chat. But don't wait until those points. Please add things as we're going along. So today's session is going to really focus on three things. We're going to describe the College and Career Readiness Expansion Project, which is this project that was implemented in Columbus, Ohio. And we're going to talk a little bit about its evaluation, just so you understand how we looked at things. We're going to look at some results that show how the model was really able to expand access to college course enrollment for underserved students. And then I'm going to describe strategies that supported this expansion. And I have posted a brief that includes all of this information in the materials that are associated with the session. So I have not double checked to make sure that that's available, but hopefully you can see that brief and download it, and it has all the information that you need. So you do not need to take notes on any of this. So let's begin with a description of the project and its context. So this project was funded by a 5-year investing in innovation grant, from the U.S. Department of Education that was awarded to Columbus State Community College. And I do think it was one of the few, if not the only, community college to be awarded an I-3 grant. This project was part of Columbus State's broader work to develop a regional workforce development strategy, and they call that the Central Ohio Compact. The project was implemented in 16 high schools and 7 districts in the Columbus region, and the district served primarily economically disadvantaged students. One of the unique features of this work is that it was led by a community college, and we've actually written a brief about this partnership, and there's a session on the partnership at 11 o'clock Eastern tomorrow morning that talks about how the community college was able to work successfully with the districts. Additionally, Jobs for the Future has actually written a brief on what it means to have a community college lead this work. And I have not uploaded that, but I will try to do that so that you can get access to that brief as well. So the goal of the CCRE project was to increase the number of students graduating from high school who were prepared for enrollment and success in post-secondary education. And to do this, they sought to implement the early college model in comprehensive high schools. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the strategies and what the model was. So the CCRE project included a variety of supports that were intended to help schools implement the early college model. So there were partnerships, multiple agencies involved in this. Columbus State Community College was the lead. Then they were working with those K-12 districts, as I mentioned, so 7 districts and 16 schools within those districts. They also worked with the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio, which is a technical assistance and professional development provider, and Jobs for the Future, which is a national organization that works on the transition from high school to workforce and post-secondary education. There were lots of coaching and professional development activities that were provided around instruction and around sort of components of the model and different aspects of the model. The community college itself did quite a bit of curriculum development and alignment work. They took one of their introductory college success skills courses called Coles 1101, and I'm sure many organizations or many colleges have something similar. And they adapted it to the high school environment, and high schools then implemented it. They also created a new course that they called Third Space, and it's actually an English course. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. They also provided extensive sets of student advising and supports. Starfish, many of you might not be familiar with that. That's an electronic early alert or progress monitoring system that keeps track of how students are doing in their college courses. And it provides alerts when students fall behind. And so the college gave the high schools access to this tool and data. And so that there were individuals at the high school that actually received the alerts. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. There were also college advisors who help students enroll in college courses and plan their schedules. And the college offered tutoring and supplemental instruction. I'll talk a little bit more about that too. There was I Know I Can, which was a local nonprofit that provided supplemental college counseling to students in the schools. And the project funded some of their work, and it also supported some communities and school work in some districts to provide more wraparound supports for students. And a key goal of the grant was to increase the number of pathways or coherent series of high school and college courses, trying to counteract that random acts of college credit that Dr. Stout mentioned. And Columbus State provided intensive technical assistance around those pathways. So these supports were intended to help comprehensive high schools implement the components of the early college program. And as you know, most early colleges, or maybe you don't know, but many of you might know, most early colleges are small, newly created schools that are focused on getting students a high school diploma and an associate degree, technical credential, or 2 years of college credit at the same time. And there have been various efforts to try to implement these strategies in comprehensive high schools. And CCRE was really one such effort. So schools were expected to implement 4 design principles. They had a college and career-ready academic program, and that was involved in emphasis on, of course, early access to college courses and structured pathways of courses. And then they also paid a lot of attention to instruction. There was a college head start, which really meant exposure, a career in college head start, exposure to college-going culture, explicit instruction in college readiness behavior, and career readiness activities as well. Wraparound student services was another part of the model. And the idea there was really that there were extensive academic and affective supports, and that schools gave students assistance with the logistical transition to college, so applications and financial aid. Then there were also a set of school level organizational practices, and that included the structures to support students, ongoing collaboration, staff, and staff professional learning. And there was an emphasis on using data to drive change. So all of these were design principles that schools were expected to emphasize and work on improving in their own settings. We studied the impact of this program using a quasi-experimental design. So we had the 16 CCRE schools, and The program, so baseline for us is 2015-16, which was the year prior to the program starting. And then what we did was find an additional 32 comparison schools that really were at the same point. So they had the same outcomes, they had the same level of dual enrollment participation, same achievement, same student characteristics, et cetera. So we really tried to find schools that were identical. And the idea is really that then over the next 3 to 4 years, both of these sets of schools experience whatever statewide policy changes are going on or cultural changes are going on. So things like COVID, for example, both sets of schools would be experiencing those. But the main difference is that this top set of schools is also experiencing CCRE, and it's the College and Career Readiness Expansion Project, so that the top schools are the only ones that are getting that exposure there. And then the idea is we look at the outcomes, we look at the differences and impacts between these two schools at the end of the program, and we actually looked at that in years 3 and 4. And any differences that we see should tell us about the results of these changes. Now, if you want more information about the project and the results from this evaluation, I'm just focusing on a very specific piece of it. You can attend the session at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and they'll talk more generally about all of the other findings that we saw. So this session really focuses on one of our research questions, and that's the extent to which CCRE high schools were able to expand access to college courses, particularly to students who are underrepresented in college. Now, to answer that question, we used data from the Ohio Department of Education, and we looked at all the students in grades 10 to 12 in our treatment and comparison sample. We did not look at grade 9 because one of our districts had created a 9th grade academy in the last year of the program, and that caused some challenges in our analysis. So we just made it simpler and said, we'll just focus on grades 10 through 12. And in this case, we're looking at both dual enrollment courses, and those courses are called College Credit Plus in Ohio, and advanced placement courses, which is really another approach for students to get college credit. So even though the intervention was really focused on dual enrollment, we wanted to look holistically at college level courses because we have found that some efforts to expand dual enrollment occur at the expense of AP. So that means that you're simply redirecting the students and not necessarily expanding the pool of students who have access to college level credits. So we looked at both. So the outcomes that we look at taking dual enrollment. We look at the percentage of students that are actually taking advanced placement courses as well, and then the percentage of students that were taking either, and that's really our primary outcome there. We also looked at 2 subgroups, and those are students who were economically disadvantaged, and then we also looked at students who are members of a racial or ethnic group underrepresented in college, and this includes students who identify as Black or African American, Native American, and Hispanic or Latinx. So I'm going to pause here and just see if there are any questions about the intervention or about the study so far. And I'm going to ask for Katie's help in finding seeing those chats. Oh, I do not see anything in the chat at this point. Katie, am I missing anything?
No, nothing in the chat so far.
Okay. So remember, if you have any questions, please do enter them in the chat. All right, so what did we see when we looked at the results for this project? So this slide here shows the impact on college course enrollment in grades 10 through 12, and we looked at it in 2 years again. So we looked at it in grades 3 and 4 for the project, so 18 and 19, and then 19 and 20. And so we have a total of about 62,000 students in this sample. So if you look, the top outcome here is dual enrollment or advanced placement. And again, that's sort of our main one, which is basically our students getting access to college level courses here. And what we see is that our treatment group had significantly more students taking dual enrollment or advanced placement courses, an increase of about 7.2 percentage points. When we break it out by dual enrollment and advanced placement, we see that dual enrollment, there's a large positive impact around the same size on dual enrollment. So this is really what's driving the overall impact. But interestingly enough, we see that there's a small positive impact on advanced placement as well, even though that difference is not statistically significant, which means that probably in reality, there's no difference between these two schools. What this does suggest is that the program was really expanding access to college courses, but that access was not coming at the expense of AP. So they weren't simply redirecting students from AP into dual enrollment courses, which we have seen in other settings. So when we look at economically disadvantaged students here, so this was what this chart is designed to show. So we looked at students who were economically disadvantaged and students who were not economically disadvantaged. And again, the dark blue bar is the treatment group. So those are our CCRE schools. The comparison are those comparison schools. And what we see is that we see large positive impacts for both of them. So the economically disadvantaged students, about 7.7 percentage point impact, not economically disadvantaged students, about a 9.6 percentage point impact. We see that there's about 1.5 times as many students who are in the, let me make sure I say this right. So, so if we look at the comparison group, there are about 1.5 times as many economically disadvantaged students in the treatment group who are taking college level courses. If we look at the not economically disadvantaged, we see that there's about 1.3 times as many students who are taking college courses in our treatment group as in our comparison group. So even though the percentage point impact is not as large in the economically disadvantaged, you are actually increasing it by a higher sort of percentage. And if we look at racial and ethnic minority groups, we see the same situation. So we see positive impacts in both groups. So they are expanding access for underrepresented students. Remember, those were students who were who identify as Black, African American, Native American, or Hispanic Latinx. And we see that there was a positive impact of about 6.8 percentage points there, and about 1.5 times as many students in the treatment groups are enrolled in college courses as in the comparison groups. When we look at not underrepresented students, those are our white and Asian students, we see an increase of about 8.7 percentage points, or about 1.3 times as many. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions about the findings. And again, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but again, if people have any questions about this or any of the findings aren't clear, please let me know. All right, so we see positive impacts, which suggested the model was successful at expanding participation among underrepresented groups. And this is counter to a lot of the research, which finds that dual enrollment participants are more likely to be white, female, and not necessarily economically disadvantaged. So how did CCRE kind of buck this trend? So in this section, I'm going to describe some of the strategies used by the project to expand access. So the strategies fall into 6 different themes, and these themes will sound very familiar again if you attended Dr. Stout's presentation, because there are a lot of the same things that Dr. Stout was talking about. So the schools spent time understanding and using data. They spent time increasing students' awareness of college courses and their importance, so making sure that students knew that college courses were important. Supporting students' college readiness, providing students with access to college courses and course pathways that could lead to industry recognized credentials, stackable certificates, and/or degrees. They also focused on removing eligibility barriers and then making sure that students were successful in college classes by embedding support structures in that. And I'm going to talk about each one of these in more depth. It's important to note that our study was not designed to test the impact of these strategies individually. So we actually really don't know which ones make a difference. However, these are actions that really probably most people should consider taking. So one of the big things that they did, and again, this harkens back to Dr. Stout's point, is that they had a more explicit focus on using their data and looking through an equity lens. And this meant looking at participation for different subgroups and identifying groups that might be underrepresented in their course enrollment. And so instead of using, for example, only things like council recommendations or teacher recommendations, they used performance data to identify students who might be eligible for taking college courses but are not currently taking them. One school reported using a strategy from the equal opportunity schools. So, and if you just Google that, you can find that information about that program. But students were given a survey to identify essentially their resilience and grit. Staff members identified students who scored highly on the survey, but were not taking college courses, and then they targeted advising towards those students. So one district staff member commented how the project had helped them move towards focusing their data using an equity lens. It's really now evolved into being more explicit with our minority and underrepresented populations and creating an advising system that is really targeting students based on their college career readiness indicators and data. So we're not having general conversations now. We are being very explicit. And part of expanding access is ensuring that students are aware of and interested in college courses. Now, some schools did that broad announcements about dual enrollment courses, just to make sure that everyone knew that they were available. Overall, though, really the schools tried to make college courses part of a broader vision of a student's future. So that's what we ended up calling this a future orientation, because we didn't really like the idea of just focusing on college or just focusing on career. But the idea is that students understand and know what they want to do in the future after they leave high school. So it's not just about getting through high school, it's about the next step that comes next. For example, one of the participating schools really encouraged students to focus on at least one of three pathways that they did post-high school. It was called enrolled, employed, or enlisted. They called it the 3 E's framework. And it really drove the work of the school. There was consistent messaging to staff, students, and families. They worked on expanding their dual enrollment course offerings, also growing their industry credential offerings, and building partnerships with local employers. Advisors also worked with the students to develop a clear plan and then help students identify the role that college level courses could play in moving that plan forward. So part of expanding access is also expanding the pool of students who are eligible for and will be successful in college courses. And so that really means an emphasis on college readiness. So districts emphasized instructional changes, and they worked with teachers to use student-centered instructional strategies that would support college readiness. Some of the districts focused on strategies that had been identified by Jobs for the Future under their common instructional framework. And these strategies are listed on the slide here. So it involves things like working together in groups, doing a lot of writing, scaffolding and supporting students using prior knowledge, lots of questioning of students, engaging students in classroom talk, where students have numerous opportunities to talk about it, what they're learning, and then literacy groups. So students are placed in structured groups which engage with complex texts. Some districts found software programs in reading and math to be helpful, but other districts did not see any changes and stopped using those. Most districts also implemented a variation on that college success skills course that I mentioned earlier. So a key part of expanding access is to actually have dual enrollment courses that students can take. And so in this program, dual enrollment courses were offered in 3 ways. So they were offered sort of on the college campus, as you might expect. They were also offered at high school, and they were taught by either a high school adjunct faculty or a college instructor. The other thing that Columbus State has created are these facilitated courses. And so basically, as students take a regular high school course, so they might be taking something like chemistry, they then also take a supplemental well, not supplemental, they take an online college course with additional assignments and exams, and that course is taught by the college instructor. The high school instructor is therefore still there then to help as a facilitator with the content. The college instructor is the one who's actually teaching the course. College success, they do offer a college success course, which was really that 1 credit kind of get your feet wet course. So figure out, is college something that you're interested in? Is this something? And give students a chance to be successful in a college level course. As Dr. Stout mentioned, it's really, there's a real importance placed on developing sequences of courses, and districts were supposed to develop pathways. And these sequences of courses could include both high school and college courses, with the idea being that they could lead to an industry credential or a major. And you can see examples of some of the different kinds of pathways that schools were developing that are on the screen. They also really tried to reduce barriers to eligibility. And so one way of reducing barriers was to offer the placement exams. So the AccuPlacer was the one that they used on the high school campus. And some districts offer basically them to everyone in their, all of their students, so that all students could get access to college courses instead of kind of restricting access to the tests. Columbus State was also really concerned about policies that they saw as restricting eligibility, and they sought to remove those barriers. So for example, the state requires a GPA requirement of 3.0, but Columbus State obtained a waiver to allow students who had GPAs between 2.5 and 2.9 to enroll in college courses. And they're tracking outcomes for those students, and will report that to the state to see whether, and that will inform certainly the policy debate about GPA requirements. Another example, and this is both a support for students and an alternative way of showing college readiness, is this third space curriculum that I mentioned earlier. So this is really, it's a course co-developed by high school and college instructors that is intended to prepare students for college English. And so Columbus State received a waiver so that the course could actually operate as a placement course. And so when students successfully completed it with an A or B or C, the students could then go directly into college level English. And finally, once students are enrolled in college courses, they really need supports in order to be successful. One of the key lessons learned was that those supports have to be proactive. There was one of the college staff said, you can't just be waiting for the students to come to you. You have to really go and do some proactive outreach. One of the primary supports that high schools had was Starfish, and that was, again, Columbus State's early alert system. There were several individuals at the school who received these alerts, which would come if students were missing too many days of school or too many assignments, or were not doing well enough in their college classes. A high school counselor described how the system worked. So I get an email, and if I log into Starfish, I can see all of those alerts. For example, right now, I got an alert from an English professor for a student that had a participation concern, attendance concern, and class completion concern, and all for the same student. And that student has health challenges. So knowing that they're struggling in the class and might not be able to attend class for a while, I reached out to the Columbus State advisor today to see what the options were. If we have a medical note, we can drop the class without penalty of a W on the student's transcript. Another support that they offered was supplemental instruction, which was offered in some districts. And essentially, this was high school students who had previously completed the course, were hired to attend the course and then provide support to their fellow high school students in it. And then finally, dual enrollment students had access to all of the regular college supports that you would see, which would include online tutoring. So I want to pause here to see if there are any questions or thoughts that people had about any of the strategies. And again, this information is included in more depth in the brief that you should be able to access with this session. All right, I see a question. Did the facilitated class also count for college credit? Is it transferable? So yes, so the idea was the facilitated class sort of had two components to it, right? It had the regular high school course, and that regular high school course just gets them the regular high school credit. And then there were sort of these supplemental assignments and supplemental pieces, and the students had to successfully complete those components in order to get the college credit. And those were all graded by the Columbus State staff. I will say, if there's anyone from Columbus State or from the project who's in this session, feel free to add comments in the chat or introduce yourself in the chat. There's Lauren. So Lauren, make sure if I'm saying anything incorrectly, you jump in and make sure that that you can correct me. Lauren, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe talk a little bit more about that facilitated model, if you don't mind? I think you can just unmute yourself.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. What happens with that is that, from an accreditation standpoint, we've got high school teachers who are wonderful, but they don't have the same accreditation standards that we would require of our college faculty. And so we partner them with a Columbus State faculty member who then is the instructor of the course. And that instructor of the course is really in charge of the course. And it is like an online course, just like Julie said. And so the high school facilitator can help students on the ground, and they can, get students moving. But the Columbus State instructor, as we call them, is the instructor of record and the one that determines the final grade. And our English department, where this is most common, has a whole structure behind kind of how they set this up, and they have a training policy for facilitators. And really, they're doing all that they can to try to help any new facilitators actually become fully credentialed, because we've learned that this is a model that doesn't necessarily age well. If you've got a veteran high school teacher, that person would want to be the full instructor of the course after some time, and our HLC rules just haven't allowed for that. So we're really trying to push those individuals getting the 18 graduate degree hours in addition to their master's degree, so that they can eventually have an on-ramp to becoming the full adjunct instructor of the course. I hope that helps, but if you have more questions, happy to jump in.
And Lauren has a lot of expertise on all of these topics. So thank you, Lauren. All right, I do not see any other questions in the chat. I'm just going to do a few little concluding thoughts here. I think one of the major takeaways is that really, if you want to focus on equity, it requires an intentional and purposeful focus. Like, you have to actually be working on this issue of equity, and it has to inform sort of all of your decisions. And the school's use of data was definitely one way to make that equity issues much more transparent. Again, the study really did not allow us to determine which of these multiple strategies would be successful. But if I were a betting woman, I'd say that you need to pay attention to multiple things to expand access, really. So it's around increasing students' aspirations. It's around being purposeful and intentional in your student recruitment, so that you're reaching students who might not necessarily think of themselves as college potential, but who are certainly capable of doing the work. It's about expanding that pool initially, so making sure that more students are prepared and you have more students that can meet, that are ready to take advantage of the courses. And then it's also really about giving students support once they're in the courses. These still are high school students, 15, 16-year-olds, many of them. And they need some additional attention and a little bit of love and extra love to make them successful. I will say in this case, there's a little bit of a cautionary tale in the story too. So in this case, we did see that some expanded access in this particular situation, it did not come at the expense of AP, but there seemed to be some sort of a trade-off between increasing the number of students who are accessing courses and the number of credits that students earned. So we saw that our comparison schools served fewer students, but those students earned more credits. So that when we looked overall at the number of credits that were earned, there was no difference, no statistically significant difference. And there was no impact on the percentage of students who earned 3 or more credits. And so I think that leads us to some questions to consider, is really sort of how do we think about the appropriate balance of expanding access versus number of credits? So this idea of sort of depth versus breadth. And then in conversations that I've been having with the Columbus State folks, it's, it doesn't really have to be an either or situation, or it shouldn't have to be an either or. It should be a both and situation, where you can both expand access and also increase the depth and the number of courses for those students. And what does that take, and how can people do that? So I'm welcome if anyone has any thoughts about that issue of sort of expanding access versus depth. Or Lauren, if you want to share any of the conversations that you all have been having in Columbus State about that particular issue. I know that's something you all have been thinking about.
Sure.
Please feel free.
Yeah, sure. We, we've been really intentional to make equity the forefront of what we're doing. And from that perspective, we have been trying to increase access and get students started on that college credit plus journey. And again, for us, that's our state name for dual enrollment. So we've been working very hard to make sure that students are getting started, but we recognize that work may then mean that they won't have as many total credits as some other students. But we feel like that early momentum on a pathway can help build to future success. And so one of the things that we're looking into is how those students matriculate over to us if they're coming here, or to another institution based on the momentum that they're building, oftentimes their junior or senior year. And so if we can get to those students earlier, so much the better, but certainly don't want to leave behind the students that, maybe weren't ready earlier, but can get started, and hope that makes a positive impact.
Thank you.
Sure.
So any other thoughts or questions, or anyone want to, anyone would like to unmute themselves and make a point? I think you can raise your hand. I see someone, great job in study. What type of, so Lauren, this might be a question for you. What type of parent communication and collaboration was used to increase all the stakeholder participation?
Sure, yeah. So we have a lot in Ohio is state regulated. So we have information nights that happen from October through February each year to involve parents into the conversation about dual enrollment possibilities. And so those were done through the state legislated way, but we were very much active participants in that. And then specific schools had other means of how they communicated to their parents. And we saw some variety in terms of how the schools reached out to their parents to let them know about this. I think too, the other way, and this just gets into kind of advanced planning, is that right around this time, schools are preparing their course registration materials for the following year. And so schools were able to put the College Credit Plus courses in their registration books so that parents could know what was involved with that. And then we also have started through this grant a CCP kickoff for the dual enrollment students that are new, so that they have an opportunity to get acclimated to some of the things that are expected. We require orientation from everyone, but not every student is perfect with complying when it's just available at their own pace. And so the CCP kickoff has been a way that we've been able to capture a few more eyeballs and make sure they're aware of the opportunities, but also the expectations.
Thank you, Lauren. We got a question from Michael here. So one concern that comes up with dual credit and increasing access is that kids are not successful, right? The grades and the GPA follow them when they do go to college. So yeah, yes, it is on your permanent record. And so the question is, if they earn a lower grade, they may start college with a lower GPA. And I think this is a valid concern. I think sometimes people use it, however, as an excuse to only select the cream of the crop, the ones that they are sure are going to do well. That's where these other pieces come into play that I was talking about. So these other pieces of increasing college readiness. So making sure that you're actually paying attention to what's going on in the high school and the instruction and the content that students are learning to ensure that more students have the opportunity to be successful in these courses. And then the other piece is that you don't leave these kids alone once they start taking these courses. You provide support. That's where I think the starfish piece was super powerful too, in terms of people being able to really keep track of how well students are doing. And this happens a lot. We do a lot of research on early colleges. I've got a session in the next hour that's going to talk about some results around early colleges. But one of the things that we see there is that they're very active in terms of tracking how well students are doing. So they try to intervene before students can run into too much trouble in their college courses. I think you cannot assume necessarily that okay, students enrolled in a college course, they're going to do great, right? There's got to be those additional supports that go into play. Because I think you don't want to push a student into a college course and they fail, and that's, then they hate college courses, they hate going to college, and the grade follows them. But I think we can do a lot more around readiness, and we can do a lot more around supports. And then there's a lot of students that just really aren't being invited to take college courses who would be perfectly capable of doing so. And then there was another point, yes, Pell eligibility for low-income students. And there's actually a little bit of a session on Friday, so tomorrow I think it's at 11, about financial aid. So in this case, we're looking particularly at early colleges and financial aid, and there's going to be a financial aid director there who will talk about some of these issues. And there'll also be a counselor that talks around some of these issues as well. So we hope you join that session. And then Nina, hi Nina. So one of my colleagues, Nina, points out that another strategy that some schools use is to assign only high school credit if students don't do well on the college tests. So that there are these courses that are sort of both, and that they only get college credit if they pass the college piece of it, but they don't get an F. Yeah. No, that's a really great point. Thank you, Nina. All right. I think we're coming to the end of the session here. I don't see any new comments on there. Thank you very much for joining us. Feel free if you'd like to reach out. There's my email address. Again, please download the brief that should be in the session information. And thank you very much for participating, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I think there's a lot of really interesting sessions there, and hopefully we're aiming for a mix of sessions that are include both research and practice. So please join us over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.